Everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn. I've been trying to find the time to be able to come for a long time, so I'm very happy that I was able to figure it out for today, because I understand that this is going to be the last one in this office, as Jeremy tells me, before the Treaty Relations Commission moves offices. So I was very happy to be able to make it here today. Today I'm going to take you a little bit through this project of heart and what I learned from it, and maybe fill in some of the blanks about myself as I go along. I guess for the purposes of sort of understanding where I come from, I'm Anishinaabe-Métis. My family comes from both here in this area and also on my mother's side, we're from the Thunder Bay area in Northwest Ontario. And so I've lived here my whole life, and I keep leaving and something keeps pulling me back. So I don't know if it's the territory or what it is, but I keep ending up back here. So I was really blessed to work on this project. You know, I've worked on a lot of different things. I do a lot of teaching work, I do museum work, I do public engagement work. But by far, and as I hope you'll understand by the end of my talk today, this was the project that I think most changed me as an academic, but also as a person, as an Indigenous person as well. So I want to talk to you today about this project, about the families and some of the people we came to know, because one of the difficult things about an inquiry, as you can imagine, is even though the mandate ends, you've invested your whole heart into this project and you're not really finished talking about it. So I'm always very grateful for the opportunity to go out and to talk about this work and to share some of the perspectives that were shared with us, understanding that my place in this is a very small place compared to all of the families that came forward and spoke to us. So you understand where I'm coming at this from as well. My role in the inquiry was as Director of Research. I wasn't there from the beginning, but I came in towards the end. And I managed the research team. I also managed the Forensic Document Review Project, as well as the Legacy Archive, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about as we go along. So I'm coming at this talk from that perspective and from the perspective of my experience in those roles only, but I'm happy to answer questions as best as I can about some of the other things that may come up at the end, and I'll make sure that I leave some time for that, so that if I don't touch on anything that you're interested in, you can just tell me and we can figure it out. Sorry, Jeremy, where's the... Okay, this is not starting well. Oh, okay. That one is forward. Okay, all right. So it's really important to note that the roots of the inquiry are really the heart of what I'm going to talk about today, and it really does begin with the families. And so many people have talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action on this topic, and the fact that many survivors who appeared before commissioners for the TRC talked about the link between intergenerational trauma rooted in residential school experiences and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so the TRC did make that recommendation, but for us and for people that worked in the heart of it and who talked to family members, we had a lot of family members involved who had been trying to raise awareness on this issue for decades, and not just 2 or 3 years, but who had been working on this since the 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s. And so some people who had been involved for over 40 years in this work, and in trying to get people to pay attention to what was called, when I got involved, a crisis. Except as I sort of talked to my research team about, I really hate the language of crisis, because I think it gives you this impression that something is just happening at that time. When we hear about a crisis, we think about something that's very immediate. Except for this is a phenomenon, a reality that families had been living with since the beginning of colonization. And so there's really a much longer history and much longer and deeper roots to this inquiry and to this issue than I think that the language of crisis belies. One of the things, oh right, it's this one. One of the things that was really important to me when I got involved was understanding the journey of the inquiry to that point and where it needed to go from then on. There had been a lot of very negative media coverage by the time that I got involved. And when I first got the call from somebody asking me if I would be interested in doing this work, I asked who had given my name, because I couldn't figure out sort of who knew me or who knew the work that I was doing. And I thought that it might be someone that didn't like me very much. And they wouldn't tell me, of course, who had given my name. But then I thought about it. I sort of hung up the phone and I talked to some people in my life, including my partner and my mom, and other people whose opinion I really value. And I explained that I'd been approached to see if I could do this work. And while I felt that it was really out of my depth as an academic, and I was really afraid in a way, I thought that, based on the stories in my family and what I understood of our history, it was really important to take up this responsibility and to do it in the best way that I could. Understanding that I think that you're placed in certain situations in your life sometimes where you don't know why you're there, and then you come to find out why you're there afterwards. And so I thought that, to honor my family, my ancestors, to honor my friends, people that I knew who had been really touched by this issue, it was important to sort of step up and to understand that even though I was really nervous about my ability to do it, so long as I kept in mind why I was there and who I was doing it for, we would find a way to do this in the best way possible. It's also true, and I think fair, that many Indigenous people think about inquiries and commissions as technologies of rule. And if you think about the rules that govern inquiries and commissions, you can see where that comes from. And so typically, inquiries and commissions have really strict rules around what constitutes evidence, for example, right? And it can really come from a very formal and legalistic Western process in which evidence is viewed as something that's sort of tested and cross-examined, and to be true it has to be written. And so there's a very big tradition of sort of colonial knowledge and baggage that comes with working for an inquiry. The other thing to consider about inquiries and commissions, and one that I really had front of mind, was the idea that often commissions function as a way that the state archives itself. So it's the way that Canada writes a new story about itself, and in positioning itself as sort of the impetus behind this inquiry, it manages to say not only that it's sort of trying to come to terms with this history, but that it's willing to turn a page. And what we heard from families is that because of the ongoing legacies and ongoing colonial violence, that wasn't true. And so I was very cautious about understanding the kind of mistrusts that many families had in the process as a root of where it comes from, which is fair, right? And also really conscious of not wanting to redo that, right? Reinscribe this notion that we're vulnerable, that we're inherently, disappearing, that this is a time-bound crisis. So I didn't want to reproduce that archive. And so I think it's really important always to look at stories that people tell about themselves. I think it's important, especially now in light of what's been happening in the past few weeks, to look at the stories that governments tell about themselves, that countries tell about themselves, and then to really critically examine what those stories are and where they're coming from. How do we know things? How do we know ourselves, right? And so I really wanted, and I think I came to the inquiry conscious of the need to write a new story and to engage in a process that stretched as much as we could the limits of a process that is often inherently colonial, right? And that serves often as a function that the state has to write a story about itself. Now, I would be bereft if I didn't mention, and she doesn't know I'm going to do this, so I don't want to embarrass her, but I'm gonna, that one of our staff members that was on the research team is here today. And so she probably knows a lot of what I'm talking about, and we had lots of conversations about this, sometimes crying, sometimes frustrated, sometimes joyful, depending on what had happened. But really, you know, this new story, writing a new story, would not have been possible without the collective talents of a group of exceptional Indigenous women and scholars who really poured their entire heart into doing this work in the best way that we could, understanding the limits of the process that we were working within. So, right, I will forget this entire presentation, and every time I go to flip, I will be confused. So just really briefly, for those who aren't familiar, the mandate that we received as an inquiry was incredibly broad. And so I arrived at the inquiry in May of 2018, when a lot of work around interpreting this mandate and operationalizing it had already been done by really talented people before me. So you don't have to read all this, but I just have it here so that I don't have to look at notes all the time. But really briefly, our mandate asked us to look into and report on systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including sexual violence. We were supposed to examine the underlying social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historical causes that contributed to the ongoing violence against Indigenous women and girls. And initially, the mandate also called upon us to look into and report on existing institutional policies and practices that address violence, and also on how effective or ineffective that these were. So as you can see, just from me going through that really quickly, it was an incredibly broad mandate. You'll notice that there's no dates on this mandate, that it encompasses contemporary realities and historical ones, that it can be an unlimited amount of stories, really, depending on how you interpret it. And then also, to add to that, early on, the National Inquiry decided that it would open up the mandate to include two-spirited and trans people, understanding that in many First Nations communities, this sort of like gender binary is not a traditional concept. There's really more of a spectrum. And then the inquiry had also decided, prior to my arrival, to open up the truth-gathering process to what were called families of the heart, understanding that people who had moved from their communities into urban centers or who had moved around Canada, as people do, had often created new communities wherever they found themselves. This was especially true in the two-spirited and transgendered community, where people often talk to us about being sort of feeling rejected from their own community or ostracized from other Indigenous people who didn't have sort of an understanding of this much deeper and longer history of gender as a spectrum versus a binary. So to an already very broad mandate, we added a lot of different perspectives to try to really holistically understand these forms of the mandate. There was a couple of different ways to address this, right? In that we could have said, we can't do this and we only have time to look at these specific things. But I think the feeling from myself and many of my Indigenous colleagues and researchers was the notion and the understanding that these things are all connected and of the relatedness of all of these issues. So you can't look at colonization in a vacuum. You must look at the structures that survive today. And one of the things that I would always say to people, and I take from other scholars who've done very good work on this, is the idea that colonization is a structure and not an event, and that that structure still exists today. And so if you want to understand colonization, you don't just have to look at the things that happen, the specific things, but you have to look at how those ideas are iterated and reiterated and reiterated in different ways over time. And so some of the very rooted ideas about dehumanizing Indigenous women and girls, about dispossession, about assimilation, about genocide that survive in historical policies still survive today. And that was really the story that we felt was truest to what we were hearing from the families. So on that note, the families and others participated in what we call the truth gathering process, which had 3 parts. So in part 1, we heard from families. So at 14 different community hearings, people came and they testified before commissioners about the experiences of their loved one or their experiences. And there were many, many people who had both personal experiences and family experiences and community experiences and loved ones experiences more generally. And so people didn't generally come and talk about one person. They often talked about many generations or many different people for whom this issue was important, or in the ways in which it had touched families, right? And so in part 1, we heard from almost 500 different witnesses at 14 community gatherings who spoke before commissioners. We also heard from some witnesses who couldn't testify publicly and whose testimony is sealed and remains considered to be in camera because it would either place them in danger or there was something sort of legally unresolved about the case that we couldn't have that as public testimony, or they didn't want it as public testimony. Also, as part of the part 1 process, people could choose to give a statement instead. So if they weren't able to or couldn't travel to a community hearing, we would send out a statement gatherer to their home or community or wherever, right, to take their statement, or we would hold statement gathering events. So this didn't ask people to testify in a crowded room in front of a bunch of people. It was sort of more of a one-on-one process with a person who had been trained to take that statement. And so we received just about 800, I think, just over 800 different statements from people. Also, as part of part 1, and understanding that there are different ways of sharing information and different ways of knowing in Indigenous communities, one of the things that people could do was to submit an artistic expression that demonstrated their truth. And so they could do this in conjunction with another form of testimony or all by itself. And so all of those artistic expressions came to be the Legacy Archive, which is a project that I came to manage, which contains over 800 different artistic expressions by MMIWG family members, some of whom also testified in another way, but some of whom didn't and simply submitted an artistic expression as a representation of their truth. It's really an exceptional collection. I'm still working with it right now. It contains beadwork and painting and poetry and songs and stories, and it's just really beautiful because each piece tells a story in and of itself. The one piece that you can see on the screen there, the big star, was actually the inspiration for the cover of our report, because we really wanted to draw from what families told us. We didn't want to license an image from somewhere else, so we wanted to use something that people had given to us as a representation of their truth. And that star is a work that was created at a statement gathering event for MMIWG families in Vancouver with an artist who helped make this all possible. I think it's about 130 different tiles, each one representing a person or a story that we heard that families were able to paint. So they might do their statement and then come and do a tile for this piece. And so it's sort of a collective representation of individual stories, but collective strength also, and resilience, I think, in sharing these stories about family members and loved ones. So it's really a very, very, very significant and beautiful piece that is part of the archive. So all of that was part 1. We also had a part 2 and 3, which I don't talk about very much because ultimately those weren't the basis of our report. We used them, but not in the same way. Part 2 focused on gathering institutional perspectives. So we invited police, social workers, healthcare workers, governments, people who typically, generally speaking, institutions who provide services or who are involved with Indigenous women and girls to talk about what they were doing or not doing in those areas, particularly in policing and in sort of safety promotion in all of its different forms. So we heard from a lot of different people within the context of part 2. And then part 3 focused on what we termed knowledge keepers and expert witnesses. So this could be Indigenous knowledge keepers or elders sometimes that came, Indigenous heads of anti-violence organizations or Indigenous academics. And so we heard from a number of people. And again, even though they came to testify as experts or as knowledge keepers, it's also true that many of them had very deeply personal experiences to share as well. I had the opportunity 2 weeks ago to travel to Brock University and to talk to staff or faculty and students there. And one of the people who testified for us was there and talked about how difficult that was to sort of come to her hearings as an academic and then feel compelled to share also a very personal story about her experience in her life. And so it was really an interesting process in that way. So in parts 2 and 3, we heard from 84 different experts and individuals representing different organizations. But as you can see, in the bulk of the over 2,500 people or perspectives that we heard from, the vast majority, over 2,000 of those, are family members and community members and individuals and survivors. So ultimately, the truth-gathering process came together to produce this report, which is called Reclaiming Power in Place. And Kelsey, staff person who's here, can attest to how difficult it was to try to find a title that brought together all of these experiences and again that conveyed what families wanted for us to share. We didn't do this work alone, and so at the very heart of the inquiry were 2 groups, the Grandmothers and Elders Advisory Circle, and so that was a very small group of traditional knowledge carriers that worked directly with commissioners on all aspects of the inquiry, including the report, but also operations, who traveled with us, who hugged us when we needed a hug, who sat with us when we needed a cry, who celebrated us with us when we finished, right? And so it was a really lovely group of people, and I'll play a video introducing them to you shortly. And the other group that really had a hand in this, a huge hand in this, was the National Family Advisory Circle, which was a group composed of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, MMIWG families who had testified for the inquiry but who wanted to have a more active role in the process. And so those people came together to form the National Family Advisory Circle, who did so much work and again traveled with us, held our hands, hugged each other, supported each other when people were sort of triggered or re-traumatized by hearing other stories. And they also helped us to validate the final report. So Reclaiming Power in Place is kind of unique, I think. And I've read a lot of reports and inquiries because I wanted to know how to make ours different. So I spent a lot of time looking at the work that had been done before. And it's really different because it really starts and ends with the perspectives of families and survivors and of Indigenous communities and nations who shared with us not only their experiences with violence in all of its forms, but also the tools that they saw as instrumental towards healing and finding sort of this better outcome for families and for combating this violence. And so Reclaiming Power in Place is both an account of these very painful stories, but it's also sort of a rallying cry for how we move forward, which, as we heard many times from elders and from families, was about reclaiming power in place. It's true that it's not true that historically and prior to colonization, every community was perfect and no one had any problems. Communities, like all communities and societies, had issues to deal with. The difference is that they knew how to deal with those issues, and they had systems and laws and governance in place to address people that broke the rules, including people who engaged in violence against other community members. So what we heard really importantly was that people still had those knowledges and communities can still use those tools They need to be empowered and facilitated in their ability to do that. But they can reclaim power and they can reclaim place, because ultimately our women and girls are sacred. And no matter if you went to an Inuit community, to a First Nations community, to a Métis community or center, you would hear that in a different form. Our women and girls are sacred. Whether it was someone that shared a story, a traditional story with you, or a song, or a medicine, or a teaching, there was always these knowledges. And so whenever I do this talk, and whenever I do it for Indigenous communities or Indigenous students, I would say to the women there, if you don't know your stories, you have them. Your community has them. And please talk to somebody and find them, because they are so beautiful. And we were privileged to be able to experience just a small slice of this amazing knowledge, but it's out there. And we really heard really fundamentally that was really the key and the way through the violence. So reclaiming empowerment and place is different in other ways too. There's two main volumes, so volume 1 and volume 2 of the primary report. There's also a supplementary report on Quebec, because we had a Quebec team that was able to do a regional study. So it's an example of the kind of regional or locally specific work that can be done with a body of testimonies from one place. And there's also a supplementary report on genocide, which really is the only thing that people have been talking about, but they should be talking about this, because it's so great. So reclaiming power and place is a really unique approach to sharing these stories. And if you read it and if you compare it to other inquiries or commissions, it's very different. It starts from the perspective of families. You won't find the names of the research team on that report. We deliberately non-authored it because they're not our stories. We really want to honor the people that shared and respectfully weave together these stories, but not take ownership of them, because they are not our stories, right? And then we really wanted to make this accessible. So what you'll find if you read this is that it's quite, it's quite accessible, I guess, but it's written deliberately to be accessible to someone from a community or an organization, or to a high school student, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, who can pick it up and who can learn something about this issue. I was recently contacted, or the commissioners were contacted by the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, which is a human rights organization that works in Canada, USA, and Mexico. And that person said, I've read a ton of reports, and usually I can just skip to the parts that are important. But he said, what's different about this report is that there's something to learn on every page. Every page of this report is important. And so I think that we really deliberately wrote it in that way. It's why we work so closely with the National Family Advisory Circle and the grandmothers to do it, to make sure that whether you were reading 3 pages or 1,000 pages, you would be able to walk away with something, right? Carrying some knowledge from these experiences, from these families. This report is also available in French, English, also Inuktitut and Inuvialuktun, which is quite historic, although the Inuvialuktun is still in translation because there's not a lot of fluent, she's like, yeah, I know. Because there's not a lot of fluent speakers that are able to work on it full time, so that's the process. And we also did work to translate the executive summary into 13 Indigenous languages to make sure that folks that wanted to read about it in sort of a, in their first language, in their language, and were able to, could do that. And so again, that's a question where we ran out of mandate time before it was done, but it was still going to be completed and posted and available in the future. Near future, we hope. Again, that's something we're still working with. Anyways, what's really significant about this report, I think, is that it's a story. It's a lot of stories. There's experiences, there's traditional knowledge, there's photos, it is sort of filled with love, and it's something that when the commissioners wanted to figure out how to hand it over to the government, they felt really strongly about it and they wanted to bundle it. So they wrapped it as a bundle, and that's how they handed it over, that's how they handed it around, because for them it was that sacred, that important, because it really is the words of families, it's those experiences. There we go. So ultimately, we were tasked to find causes, and we did. Except I think that the causes that we found were not necessarily what folks were expecting, because I think that often when you have a commission or an inquiry, people want the solution to be really simple. They want you to say, if you put more money into the police, this will be fixed. If you find the perpetrators for all these crimes, everything will be fine. Except what we actually found, and what was sort of based on what families told us, was much, much, much more complicated and requires a really fundamental shift in society and not a band-aid solution. So the first ongoing form of violence and the root cause that we found was intergenerational and multi-generational trauma. Kelsey can attest to this because she listened to thousands of stories too, but in every single story that people shared with us, I would say in almost all cases, maybe in all cases, there was multiple generations of trauma. So someone's story might begin in residential schools, and then the conclusion of that story might end with a family member who is missing or who has been murdered, right? And it might go through residential schools and the 60s scoop and child apprehension today, and then ultimately the person becomes a target of violence, right? In other cases, for example, with Inuit, many Inuit talked to us about the idea that they would have to travel outside of the community for different care, and that the community was still bearing a lot of the scars of forced relocation or of residential schools in the north. And so when the people came to a new center where they didn't know anybody and they didn't have any support, they didn't have the supportive community, in part that multi-generational or intergenerational trauma would follow them to the new environment. So that was the first root cause. Economic and social marginalization. It's absolutely true when you look at the history of policies in Canada that this is an active process. So many people look at marginalization as sort of a passive thing, like a thing that just happens, except when you look at the history of action and inaction around this issue, you find out that it's quite active, actually. And that economic and social marginalization in many cases led people to living in places that they didn't want to live, to commuting to jobs that they weren't comfortable doing or that were unsafe for them at that time, led people to having to relocate to be educated to places that they didn't know or that they didn't know anybody that could provide sort of a network of support. So economic and social marginalization, but as an active process and an ongoing process. The third thing that we found was lack of institutional will in maintaining the status quo. So often, and especially when we talked to institutions and we looked at the historical record, we could tell that institutions and governments know that their policies are not working or are actively targeting people, but are unwilling to invest the person power or the financial resources to address these issues in a fundamental way. And then finally, the fourth root cause that we found was the failure to recognize the agency and expertise of Indigenous women and Indigenous people. And so we heard countless times about programs that were actually making a difference, programs that were saving lives, initiatives that were started and weren't able to be continued because of the funding requirements or the very short window of support that many projects had. And so certainly what we heard from communities and from survivors and from families was that they had ideas. They had ways to do this. It's just that they weren't able to continue those programs because there was a failure to recognize that they held the solutions, that they held the knowledge that was necessary to do something about it. Ultimately, though, what we heard in every single story, and what I think is really important to point out, is that whether you were talking to a Métis person living in an urban center, a First Nations person from a southern community, a First Nations person coming into school to a city from the north, or even living in their community, an Inuk woman from Igloolik, every single story had a point of commonality, and we really thought for a long time about how can we bring all of these very distinct, localized, and diverse experiences together. What is that thread that binds all of these experiences together? And what it really was, when you really looked at the elements of the stories of the individual survivors and family stories, was the idea that in every single story, every single situation that we heard about where somebody was missing or had been murdered or had been the target of some other form of violence, because remember, it's all forms of violence, what happened to them was the product of a series of encounters, moments where they came across or came up against a person or an institution or a policy that failed to help and that eventually sort of sent them either immediately or eventually into the position of being targeted for violence. But what we saw is that within the context of these encounters, if all of these encounters could lead people to harm, what would happen if they could lead people to healing? What would happen if we changed the nature, if people, if institutions, if governments worked to change the nature of these encounters into healing encounters, change the nature of their interactions and policies and ideas into things that would empower and uphold our rights to safety and life, right? And so we heard about that, and it was really important as sort of a thread that tied it together. It's also really important because it shows that there's not just a job for governments in this. There is a job for government. There's no doubt about it, absolutely. But there's a job for everybody, whether teachers, healthcare workers, media, people that work in the resource industry, companies, right? So there's a job for everyone in this. Everybody is responsible for changing the nature of their encounters with families, with communities, and with Indigenous people more generally. And so we really saw these moments, and if you have a chance to go into the report, you can probably easily identify them on your own, where if somebody had acted differently, a different outcome would have happened. So a couple of quick examples, because I want to leave time for questions. A couple of quick examples of that. We heard from somebody who wanted to go to the police station to report her daughter missing, but she was deaf and they couldn't provide an interpreter. And as a result, that day she was not able to do her report. She had to come back several days later. But what would have happened if that person had been able to register a missing persons report on that day, and if people had started looking on that day, right? Another example, we heard about somebody who had aged out of child welfare, but who had a young son and who still had contact with her mother. She decided she was struggling with substance issues, and she decided that she wanted to get clean. She wanted to raise her son. So she phoned her mom to say, can you phone my worker, and can you see if there's a program that I can get into right away? I want to be a mother. I want to raise my son. The mother phoned the child welfare worker, who told her there was nothing they could do because the woman had aged out of care. The young woman had aged out of care. And a couple of weeks later, I think that woman was found murdered because she couldn't get into a program. But what would have happened if that day she could have gotten into a program? If there were resources or support for that young mother that made it that she could be there for her son. Right? So you can see that these encounters break down at a million different places, but that they're if you can flip them, right, then I think that they have the power to change the outcome for many families. Ultimately, the difficulty with inquiries is that they don't tend towards accountability. Many people know them as paper tigers because what they do is they produce a book, a report, right? That's what they're mandated to do. And then it's often up to the government or the institution to decide what they're going to do with it. We struggled with that too, because what families told us is we don't want this to sit on a shelf. We don't want a book that's going to sit on a shelf forever. And so we thought about what were some accountability things that already exist that we can hold governments to, although not perfect instruments by any means, and we always recognize the limitations. What can families do if in 2 years nothing happens? If in 5 years nothing happens with their case or with their loved one or with Canada to make, to confront the things that target, the factors that target Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited and trans people. And for that, we look to the International Human Rights Framework and to Indigenous rights frameworks, understanding that Canada has made public commitments public and enforceable international commitments to honour the basic human rights of all people in Canada, and that its failure to protect Indigenous women and girls is a failure to adhere to important conventions like the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide, like the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, like the Covenant or the Covenant to End Racial Discrimination, the Covenant to End Violence Against Women. And so what Canada really doesn't like is to be embarrassed in the international arena, and so that was part of it. But what it also really doesn't like is to be told that its commitment to human rights that it often talks about in international forum, including right now when seeking a seat on the Security Council, that they're in violation of those very ideals that they purport to defend. Our 231 calls for justice have been characterized by many people as too many calls, too complicated, too expensive. And I guess that for us it was a struggle to come up with calls that could be applicable to all of these very different circumstances, these very different personal stories that we heard. Ultimately, we made calls in areas that related to the government's obligation to protect fundamental rights, as well as sort of what families told us about Indigenous rights and what was important in those relationships. Understanding that none of the implementation of these calls is going to be significant or important if they're not done with an eye towards these principles for change. So the principles for change that we really leaned on was the idea of substantive equality, that not everybody, that equality doesn't mean that everybody gets the same thing. It means that you might have to provide different supports or services to get people to a level of safety that is required. The second one is self-determined and Indigenous-led solutions and services, again, as a way to uphold the knowledge and expertise and the agency that we heard about from families, from community workers, from women doing work with youth, for example. And then finally, recognizing distinctions. It's the realization that the solutions required for an Inuk woman living in a northern community might be different than for a First Nations woman living in Winnipeg, or a Métis woman living in Alberta in a settlement. And so understanding that all of the recommendations have to be implemented with an eye towards these principles is really important, because it's really difficult to make very large global recommendations on very distinctive very localized stories of violence. I want to say on this note that a lot of people have criticized us for too many calls for justice. There's just too many. 231 is too many, they say. But we want to say that these things might be expensive and they might be big things, big ideas. But poverty is very expensive. Healthcare is very expensive. Failure to implement treaties or fighting Indigenous people in courts is also very expensive. Child welfare is extremely expensive. And so all of these different things that people always complain about as sort of being so expensive, if we allow these things to continue, it's ultimately much more expensive than it is to address these things bottom line right now. And so while I don't like to talk bottom line, I'm often in a position where I'm talking to governments or civil servants, and I always say, here's the bottom line, folks. If you don't do this, the implementation, the cost of implementation, these calls for justice right now is a fraction of what it will cost to maintain marginalization, to maintain colonial violence for 150 years, for generations into the future. What we really want for people to do after they read the report is become change makers. This is true at all different levels of society and no matter what people do. And so we're inspired by families to be change makers. It's why we go around and talk to people. It's why many of the staff that work for the inquiry have not ended up in places where they're helping people in different ways, where they're doing work for communities in different ways. One of our research staff is now the head of an association that's working to coordinate the efforts of organizations who want to end violence against women. One of our former staff is working for the United Way. So many of our former staff are working in areas that relate to our work here and have really taken up this mantle of being change makers in their own contexts, in their own communities, and in Canada at large. So I know that we're almost out of time and you all probably have to get back to work, but as a closing, I really do want to play you a video quickly to introduce you to some of these people that walked alongside us this whole way. The fact that they walked alongside us is why I'm wearing this today. This medallion was gifted to me by one of our grandmothers from Samson Cree Nation. Aunt Kelsey received one as well for her exemplary work. And she said to me when she gave this to me, she said, this has walked with me for over 40 years, and now I want for it to walk with you. And so whenever I do these talks, whenever I'm talking to people, I bring this with me because I think that she gave this to me so I could continue to do this work and to share the messages from the families and the grandmothers. And so this is my most special thing as a gift. And so I would like to close with introducing you to some of our families and grandmothers, and then I think we'll have a couple of minutes for questions if you have time.
Grandmother Circle.
Nous sommes le cercle des grands-mères. We are the grandmother circle
Of Canada's
Historic First National Inquiry.
We are carriers of traditional knowledge. Our role is to provide teachings and guidance.
We have witnessed the process of a national inquiry and borne witness to the family members and survivors who have testified. We honor the tremendous courage of the Indigenous families and survivors who have shared their difficult stories with us.
As grandmothers and elders from many nations, we have clearly heard from the families, survivors, two-spirited and trans people that the violence must stop.
That the violence must stop.
That the violence must stop.
Nous croyons en la force et en la puissance de nos femmes, de nos filles et de nos personnes bispirituelles et transgenres autochtones.
Since the beginning of European contact, we have experienced the full impact of colonial violence.
This targeting genocide of our women, girls, two-spirited, and trans people is criminal.
Canada must be accountable for its inaction that has led to ongoing violence.
Our ancestors had a beautiful vision of what Canada could be. Nations and peoples living side by side in peace and prosperity.
That vision is still waiting to be realized.
We are the people of the land. We have a responsibility to protect the land as the land protects us.
La terre nous donne la vie, tout comme nos femmes.
We want Canada to know that our women are the heart and home fires of our nations.
For the Inuit, the kundak is that home fire which sustains our land.
Women are the life givers as well as the warriors, fighting to keep our women and children safe.
We are the Red Women Rising. Our Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited, and trans people are sacred, valued, loved, and missed. They matter.
Elles sont importantes.
They matter.
Pagona kilisinami ko Kanadami tokotaw si mayu nuibo iksinaktaw tayam nasuki.
We are all responsible to our children now and for the children still to come.
We challenge all Canadians to lead the national inquiry's final report.
Because we all have a responsibility to act.
C'est un projet pour un Canada nouveau.
This is a vision for a new Canada.
This is a vision for a new Canada.
This is a vision for a new Canada.
So that was the grandmothers, and then just one more quick one. And this is the families who created their own message for this video as well.
Je suis ma grand-mère.
I am my mother.
Je suis ma sœur.
I am my auntie.
Anna, ma sœur.
I am my daughter. Panigiyobuma.
I am my wife.
I am my best friend.
We are the families and survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited, and trans people. We are the voices of our lost loved ones who are calling out to be found, and we echo their cries for justice.
We shed tears.
We shed tears for our sisters.
Nous sommes restés en arrière
To tell their stories.
pour partager la vérité. Our ancestors protected our ways
so we could survive and persevere.
Our relationship with Canada was created in peace,
friendship, and trust.
la paix, l'amitié et la confiance.
Promising prosperity.
Abundance and well-being. La confiance brisée a érodé.
Broken trust has eroded this relationship.
Jeopardizing what we hold most sacred.
Our women and girls,
Nos femmes et nos filles.
we are here to restore their dignity
And forge a path for change.
Our children are our future.
We must protect them.
Nous devons les protéger.
We ask all Canadians
to stay with us.
in ending all forms of violence. Learn about the truthful
La vraie histoire of the relationship
between First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people and Canada.
Honor that truth by upholding their rights.
By upholding their rights and respecting our sisters,
et en respectant leurs valeurs,
our language,
our treaties, and our way of life.
with clean water, housing, and safety. And respecting our women, our children, and our families. Donner vie à la vérité en devenant des alliés. By becoming allies and advocating for change.
Good job.
Thank you so much. Taken, not forgotten.
Taken, not forgotten.
I am here to speak for those who cannot speak. Almost.
Our women and girls are sacred.
Our women and girls are sacred.
I'm here for justice.
I am a change maker. Are you?
J'initie le changement. Et vous? I am a change maker. Are you?